Streets of Jack the Ripper. This is the Tower of London, a 900-year-old building surrounded by a modern city. A city full of history, not all of it good. And this is a map of the current East End of London. The Whitechapel murders took place between 1888 and 1891. 11 women were killed. 5 are thought to be the work of one man, Jack the Ripper. Much has changed since then in the East End of London. After World War II bombings and redevelopment and time, many of the streets have gone. Streets I knew as a young man have disappeared. The sights that Jack the Ripper and his victims would have seen are few and far between now, but some are still there. The crime scenes of 5 murders said to be the Rippers are all in a small area of the East End. Some of the sights and streets of those days have stretched from that time to this time. Streets that Jack stalked down looking for women of the night. Walls that his victims may have leant against while waiting for a customer. Or alleyways and streets they once walked through to go about their daily business. Come with me now to see the streets of modern Whitechapel that long ago hid a monster. The Whitechapel murders that many believe was the work of Jack the Ripper all took place in a small part of the East End. We will look at the streets of this area as they are today. Some will be new, but others will be from that time and would have been used by the Ripper and his victims. For a feel of how it would have looked back then, here are some streets that for the most part have not changed and would be recognisable to anyone from the Victorian times. Spital Square, all these streets you see now were there at the time of Jack the Ripper. It is quite possible and likely that his victims and the murderer used these very streets and saw these very sights. Elder Street. Elder Street has changed little since 1888, and the victims of the Ripper would still recognise it today. London in Victorian times was covered in a smog created by coal burning of the new industrial age. Houses were built close together, creating slums. The streets were narrow and crisscrossed by narrow alleyways and lanes. Wilk Street. At night it was poorly lit, and the light did not push far into the dark and the smog. The people of the East End lived from hand to mouth, trying each day to make enough money for food and a bed for the night, and often not achieving either, and being left out in the dark with no money to pay the doss house they stayed in. Wilk Street is another street that is largely unchanged and would be recognisable by anyone from that era. At the end of the road, you can see the white wall that is part of the Christ Church. When making this film, the Christ Church at Spitalfields stood out, for the simple reason it appears to be in the middle of all the 5 Ripper crime scenes, and many of, if not all the victims, live very close to it. To give you an idea of the area, here are the streets we've just looked at. These would have been the better streets to the north of the church. 3 victims were known to use doss houses in the slums of Flower and Dean Street, which is no longer there. The only part of that street that is left now is called Lowersworth Close, and here it is. The street continued through those gates in 1888 to an overcrowded slum area and was finally removed in the 1920s. Look at how close the street was to the church. Another victim lived across the road from the church in Miller's Court. Now let's look at some of the streets that the victims would have used as they are today. Not much remains now but the streets themselves. Fashion Street, Toynbee Street, these streets would have been used by the Ripper and the victims on the night of their murders. Wentworth Street. These streets would have been overcrowded and are to the south of the church. The alleyways and lanes of old London. In Victorian London there were many narrow alleyways and lanes that people have had to use on a daily basis. All sorts of strange things could happen out of sight in these lanes. In this chapter we will take a look at some of the alleyways and lanes in the area that Jack the Ripper was stalking his victims. These alleyways and lanes may be the reason he was able to escape so easily. Imagine walking down this narrow street at night time and in the smog when you can only hear footsteps behind you. In the East End slums, there were many alleyways and lanes linking streets and buildings. Many have gone now, however some in the area are still there. These would have made for a quick escape or make stalking someone much easier for the Ripper. These alleyways and lanes would have been used by the victims to walk through and to carry out their nightly business. Can you imagine how scary they must have been back in those days of dark and smoggy nights?